If there is one question that I needed answered, if there was one reason that I wrote the show in order for me to see it, as opposed to thinking that it would be interesting to a large audience, I thought I and my mother before her and virtually everyone I've ever known has struggled with the question of what is the place of sexuality in a godly life. That was the big one, because one of the things that drove me from the tradition was that once I realized I was not going to marry the person that the church expected me to marry, that there was such a clear dichotomy in the way I had been taught that I could either be as I perceived God made me, or I could be in the church. I couldn't be both. And going back a generation, my mother, who had to divorce her first husband, found herself in a similar situation. She made a sexually unorthodox choice, and in so doing, had to choose between her personal safety or the spiritual solace that she had found in that tradition. Very painful for both generations. And like virtually every other Catholic man I know who found out that he was gay later on, very, very painful thing. And if you read Mary Magdalene, I came into it as a gay man, but I think that notion of sexuality as being the problem of, rather than a precondition to a moral life, is something that's everywhere in the culture. I think that women have borne the burden of that disproportionately, but it hits all of us. I would simply ask, if you doubt that, what the metaphor of the virgin birth says about male sexuality. And keep in mind, the virgin birth is a male idea, But the idea that the Savior of the universe could only come into the world untouched by a human father. Think about that for a second. So that was the wound that I needed to be healed. And in looking at this, and in reading through Accacella's summary of the myth of Mary Magdalene, the whole notion of the repentant prostitute, which, as such, made her an enormous success in Catholic iconography. Once that 6th century sermon that declared, with no scriptural basis whatsoever, but that's another story, but declared that is 4 women in the New Testament: Mary of Egypt, who was a reformed prostitute, Mary of Bethany, Lazarus' sister, an unnamed sinner who washes Christ's feet with her hair when she bursts into a dinner that he's having with Simon the Pharisee, and Mary Magdalene were all one woman, and she was the repentant Eve. This archetype of a woman who brings down humanity through sexualized inquiry really goes back to the Old Testament. Although in the Old Testament you also have the Goddess Wisdom and the Song of Songs, you have godly eroticism, which we seem to have left out of the New Testament. So in many ways, while personally it was a way of trying to get I or my mother in a room with Jesus Christ and said, what about us? What about, people who want to be both good and physical? You don't have anything for us, at least your heirs have left whatever wisdom you might have bequeathed to us out of the record. And we'd like to talk about that, number one. But number two, I would argue that Mary Magdalene serves for the culture at large the very same function. She is the mad woman in the attic. She won't go away. And the very... In the iconography, the very glamorous iconography, you have the tears, but you also have the sexual charisma. Look at the Titian, images, where, yes, the grief, the emotionality is clear, but also the radiance of the sexual body is clear.